today we kick off our campaign to pass citizen-only voting amendments that are on the ballot this November in 8 states. Before we hear from our organization's president and elected officials who have been working on this issue, I want to recognize the other folks up here who have worked so hard to make this possible. First of all, Kevrick McCain, who is our leader in North Carolina and who has also become a huge help in other states like Georgia and Wisconsin. Kevrick, thank you very much. Craig Scott. Craig is a ACV spokesperson. He also has a very compelling life story that you may be interested in. One of the reasons I wanted to have these folks up here and recognize them is because I think media people who will not hear them today may want to talk to them after this press conference. Some great stories and great people. Simone Pemberton, who has been a great activist in North Carolina and is running for the state Senate against one of only 4 people in the Senate who voted against the citizen-only voting amendment that's on the ballot this November. Thank you, Simone. Timothy McCain. Timothy's from North Carolina, has been very active in our door-knocking efforts in North Carolina and in Georgia. Been a big help. Thank you, Tim. Gil Pagone, who's from North Carolina and is with Hispanos del Sur, an organization that works to get Hispanic voters out. Thank you, Gil. Will Martin. Will is leading the charge in Wisconsin with ACV. That's question 1 on this November's ballot. Thank you very much, Will. Becky Arps. Becky is our research director. She happens to be from Missouri. Missouri is also on the ballot this November with a citizen-only voting amendment. And Chris Arps, I think they know each other, who is our president emeritus, is also a voice on radio in Missouri. And Jack Tomczak. Jack is our vice president of outreach for media people. He's your best person to call and has done a fantastic job. I want to thank everybody that I've just mentioned. You guys can go ahead and have a seat, but I thank you very much for making this all possible. And Abby, you have to stay up here. And actually, let me get all the elected officials up here, and we will take it one at a time. There is much talk about non-citizen voting in the United States of America. There is disagreement about how much it happens or doesn't happen when folks are talking about non-citizens voting illegally. But we are here today to talk about something that's very certain. There are non-citizens voting legally in the United States of America in 4 states, in 19 cities, and we believe that is something that the American people ought to get to weigh in on. It's happening here in Washington, D.C., in San Francisco, in Oakland, 11 cities in Maryland, 3 in Vermont. 3/4 of the cities that have allowed non-citizens to vote allow non-citizens in the country illegally to also vote. We believe only citizens should vote. And we have worked very hard to give voters in 8 states a chance to weigh in directly on that issue this November. With that, I'd like to introduce our president, Abby McCullough, to say a few words.
Thank you so much for having me and for allowing me to speak with you today. My name is indeed Avi McCullough, but I was actually born Evila Montegan de Oliveira Batista. I was born in Sao Paulo, Brazil, and by fortuitous chance, my mother met an American who was on business with Kimberly Clark. She worked at the same office, and they met in Brazil. They wrote letters back and forth for 3 years and started a love story that transcended borders. At that time, we were so poor that we didn't even have a house phone. My mother couldn't even call the man that she deeply loved. By the time their love story continued, they had each respectively dated other people and realized that there was nobody else on the globe for one another. So my now father, my stepdad, invited my mother and I to come and visit him in the United States. We came legally to this country on a visa, and after spending one Christmas together, he knew that we could never spend a Christmas apart again. So he proposed to my mother. At that time, we were granted green cards, which ironically are not green, they're actually pink. But the green cards permitted me to live and work in the United States for the duration of my life. My mother was granted the same right. We never thought about citizenship. It really didn't ever come up as an issue. I attended American schools, I worked for American businesses, but it wasn't until I hit the ripe age of 18 that I realized I don't have the right to vote. I began the long, tedious, grueling process of becoming an American citizen. And during this process, I realized that American schools maybe aren't teaching the things that they need to as it pertains to our government. I had to study like I'd never studied before, just to be able to take the entrance exam to enter this country, something that most people get just by being born here. The citizenship process taught me so much, not only about this incredible country that we live in, but about our legal system, about our political system, and all of the things that it means to be a responsible voter. I advocate for citizen-only voting because citizenship truly transformed my understanding of this incredible country that we live in. It's so important, it's so vital for people to understand what it is they're fighting for, what it is they believe in, what this country was founded on, in order for them to be informed citizens that can make these wise decisions as well. My mother and I are now both citizens. We actually went through the process separately. For me, it took several years. It took a lot of money. It took driving 5 hours one way. It took renouncing the citizenship of my home birth country. And I did it with so much love and so much conviction because I truly believe that this is the greatest nation in the world. It gives opportunity that people cannot even begin to fathom. The fact that you can be born here in any class system and find your way to the top, work diligently enough to reach something, to make something of yourself, is one of the hallmarks of this country. And that's something that my family in Brazil has not been afforded. When you are born poor, you will die poor. There is no opportunity for you. I understand the reason that so many people want to flock to this country. I absolutely respect it, but I also respect the legal system in which this country was founded, and I respect doing so in a legal manner. When it comes to voting, it's not about being anti-citizen or anti-foreigners. It's about being a part of this family, of this home. You wouldn't let your neighbor weigh in on your family budget, but you might invite them to dinner. It's the same concept. Citizen-only voting matters so much because people need to make informed decisions. They need to understand what it is they're vying for. The country that I love, oh man, the love I have for it just expanded profoundly when I became a citizen. To stand in that naturalization ceremony, to get your certificate that says I'm American, it's so cool. And I will never apologize for getting choked up about America, and I will never apologize for crying at the Star-Spangled Banner because I do every time. This is an incredible country, and the opportunities we are afforded are tremendous, and we need to protect those opportunities, not only for our sake, but for the sake of future citizens to come. Thank you.
Thank you, Avi. Now we will hear from Secretary of State Brad Raffensperger from Georgia. I think many of you may know of him already. He is someone who has worked on this issue much longer than anyone else I know. Years ago, when he was a state legislator, put a measure in to make this the law in Georgia, continues to work on it, and has been a huge help to this movement all over the country. Brad.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. The reason why I'm here today is because I've long believed, long before I was Secretary of State, probably somewhere when I was around 10 years old, but somewhere along the line, I just realized how precious it was to be an American citizen. And as I looked at some of our state laws, I realized that we need, in Georgia, a constitutional amendment to make sure only American citizens vote in our elections. But I believe it doesn't just start at the top of the ticket. I think it starts at every single office holder, from the school board to county commission, city council, state house, state senate. I believe no matter where you're elected in Georgia or anywhere in the rest of the country, that it should require that you are an American citizen. I believe that America is the greatest country in the world, and I believe that we are a nation for good. I love America, and I love American citizenship. I love what we stand for. I'm proud of our founders and their wisdom. I think about Washington, Jefferson, Madison. And I think we honor them when we make sure that only American citizens could vote. I think also about anyone that has ever served in the military, that actually wore the uniform and then took it out in battle. And then some who never came home, who lost their life, dying, fighting for our freedom. And I think that commitment that they had for our nation, we honor that when we do two things: when we vote in our elections, and when we make sure only American citizens are voting in those elections. I think that great nations should never devalue two things: our currency and American citizenship. I believe that we are the gold standard. I don't think there's any other country in the world that allows non-citizens to vote. But frankly, I don't care what the rest of the world does. America is the gold standard. We set the model, we lead, and only American citizens should be voting in our elections. And if you just think about this, I heard a great analogy, but here's another one, because I think most common sense Americans can kind of help noodle through this idea. Because a lot of times people, there'll be naysayers about this non-citizen, voting. But I think that voting is more important than being on a jury pool. And I think being on a jury pool is very important. You have to be an American citizen to be on a jury anywhere in America. Doesn't it not make sense that a more precious right, the right to vote, should require American citizens only to be able to exercise that right to vote? So I believe that no matter where you're elected, from president, school board, county commissioner, that we should require only Americans to vote in our elections. And then you think about right now with the open border policy that we've had in place for several years now, voters are concerned about non-citizen voting. Well, I can give you great news about in Georgia. Because we partner with our Department of Driver Services, we have robust citizenship verification. And so before people go on the voter rolls, Department of Driver Services, who actually registers about 99% of new voters or when they renew their driver's license, is going to do a robust citizenship verification. And yet we've been sued already in Georgia by two groups. Stacey Abrams' group, Fair Fight. Fair Fight Action sued us in federal court. We met them and we beat them in a court of law. Then we were sued by the Georgia Coalition for the People's Agenda. So, same thing, and they wanted to stop us from doing citizenship verification. We met them in a court of law, and we did prevail. We think that sets great legal precedent for anyone in the country that wants to do citizenship verification the way Georgia does. We think it makes sure that only American citizens are on the voter rolls, so only American citizens are voting in our elections. So we think that's really important, and that's why I'm here today, because I think it's very important that only American citizens ever vote in our elections here in America. Thank you very much.
Next, I want to introduce Julian Bradley, state senator from Wisconsin, who led the charge to put question 1 on this November's ballot.
Thank you. Well, good morning. We've heard so much already this morning why citizenship matters so much, and that's why these questions are coming forward. In the state of Wisconsin, we are the most purple of purple states. In the last 2 presidential elections, they've been decided by 20,000 votes or less. In 2 gubernatorial elections ago, that election was decided by roughly 20,000 votes. Yet this issue of citizen-only voting is polling somewhere over 75%. We passed it with overwhelming support in the Senate and the Assembly twice in order to get it to the people via referendum so that they can have their voices heard. That is such a critical part of this process. The right to vote and getting your vote counted it's such a beautiful part of the referendum process for this question, because it does remind everybody why we're doing it. We're doing it to protect your rights as a citizen. We're doing it to protect your right to vote. If you go back to 2016, you heard a lot of people talking about how there was a lot of integrity issues with the elections. In 2020, you heard it again. Well, now, in 2024, we're going to put a ballot initiative out there that is going to try to shore up at least another piece where people are concerned about who's voting and how they're voting. I don't care how they vote. I don't care how any citizen votes. Of course, I'm going to do my part to try to get them to vote the way I would like them to. But what's most important is who is voting. And we want to make sure that only American citizens are voting. That was the intent. In Wisconsin, the law says and we've heard that there are municipalities all over the country that are taking that to mean, well, it's not exclusionary, so anybody else can. We're going to correct that in November. We will ensure that only American citizens can vote, and we're going to restore a little more integrity to our elections. Thank you.
Next, let's hear from Brad Overcash, state senator from North Carolina. Brad was instrumental in making it happen there.
Well, thank you very much, Paul. It's an honor to be here. Thanks to everyone who's here from the press and also fellow legislators. I will say this. In North Carolina, it was important for our legislature, and you are hearing from legislators, but this is really about the people of North Carolina and about the people of the other 7 states with this on it. All we did as a legislature, it was empower the people of North Carolina to make the decision to amend their own constitution to declare that citizens and only citizens are allowed to vote in our state and in these other states where they've taken this great measure. So it's an honor to be here. Thank you for all you've done to help make this happen, and I appreciate it.
Thank you, Brad. Next, we'll hear from Senator Shane Jett from Oklahoma.
Thank you, Paul. And it's an honor to be here and to be able to stand up for a country that I have raised my right hand, both as a member of the Oklahoma House of Representatives, a member of the state Senate currently, and also as an intelligence officer in the United States Navy. I speak to you not only as a former officer, as an elected official, but as a daddy and a husband to my wife, who I met in Brazil. Her boyfriend was nice enough to introduce her to me at his church. Nice guy. And we got married 2 years after that, and brought her back to Oklahoma, where we started a home. We have 3 beautiful daughters. And I began to work on the immigration process myself as a House member. And I did it myself because it's very expensive, and we were rich in faith and hope and love and low on cash. And so I did all the work myself. I know the tremendous amount of paperwork, the meticulousness, and you're dealing with the bureaucracy, so document, get it in. It's a laborious process. And then watching my wife with other immigrants raise their right hand and swear an oath that was very similar to the oath that I swore to uphold the Constitution and defend it against all enemies, foreign and domestic, and to swear that she was going to be loyal to this country that I love so much. It was a lot like she said it was a lot like getting married again. So instead of swearing loyalty to her husband, and I swore my loyalty to her, she swore loyalty to the United States. And when you think about things you care about, if you want to have an opinion, that matters, that's going to be definitive, then you need to demonstrate a commitment that you have a right at that table. So I had all kinds of opinions about my wife-to-be, but until I put a ring on her, my opinion was just an opinion. And then once we had that commitment, that ring in place that says, I am committed to you, did the dynamic change. So my wife, when I met her, was Ana Carolina Fejera Gomez. And when I put that ring on her, she became Ana Carolina Gomez Jet. We belong to each other. As a Navy intelligence officer, I couldn't go into a skiff with a top secret clearance without a need to know what was behind that door. Why? Because I could hurt the United States with the information that lay beyond that door. And I had to be investigated to make sure that my commitment was firm to the United States. Well, in the United States, the civilian form of government, the President of the United States, is over the military. And I couldn't get access to military intelligence until they knew I and my commitment to the United States was firm and documented. And we cannot have people who do not have a commitment to this country, who hasn't been vetted, who hasn't sworn an oath that they're here to build and thrive and commit and lay down their life if necessary for this country, choosing who our elected officials are at any level. And so it's as a House member and as a senator, being able to speak on behalf of my district, Democrats and Republicans polled. 80% of Democrats says we need to make sure that people who are committed to this country, have done it the right way, are getting to choose who our leaders are. 90% of Republicans. This is a nonpartisan issue. Those individuals who have come against us, calling us all kinds of hideous names, that our motivation is because we hate people, those individuals are also parroting that this is an evil country, and they fundamentally want to change the country at its core. And what better way to do that than to bring someone who doesn't comprehend what we have beyond economic opportunity and begin voting to erode the sovereignty of this country. If you love this country, then put your ring on and become a United States citizen and show a commitment that you're here to build and not tear down. And that's why I'm proud to stand with my fellow elected leaders and with over 85% of American citizens who believe if you want to be part of this country, show it with commitment and do it the right way.
Thank you, Shane. And Shane, go ahead and stay up here. I'm going to introduce Josh Kimbrell, but I just want to mention when he's through, Brad, Julian, if you'd come back up because this press corps may have some questions. But let me introduce Josh Kimbrell, State Senator from South Carolina.
Thank you, sir. Good morning, everybody, and thank you for being here. You've heard a lot of us today talk about how we have family members who are naturalized citizens. My wife is a first-generation legal immigrant to the country. So you keep hearing all these people talk about this is somehow against people coming to the country, or it's nativist, or somehow it's prejudice. This is not about that. This is about making sure that the people who either born in this country or citizens or become naturalized citizens have that citizenship honored. And throughout history, if you look at, I believe history is a good guide. You're doomed to repeat the mistakes of the past or miss the blessings of good decisions made in the past if you don't study history. And every major empire in the history of the world, every major power in the history of the world, look at the Romans as a great example of that. As the value of citizenship began to be diminished, as the value of citizenship and the rights and privileges and responsibilities inherent to that citizenship were undermined, you started to see a dissolution of society, a breakdown of order, a breakdown of what it meant to be a member of that country, a citizen of that country. And so in this country, we're standing up for that. We're going to defend the rights and the privileges and responsibilities that come with citizenship. Whether you chose to become a citizen or you're born here as a citizen, we believe citizenship really does matter. And like so many other things, if you look in the city we're in today in Washington, the United States Congress has had this very debate about defending citizen-only voting. And that's in no small part because of Washington, D.C.'s decision at the city level to allow non-citizens to vote here. And in the case of citizen-only voting, Washington, D.C. stands for they don't care. Washington doesn't care if you're a citizen. You can vote here in city municipal elections, and they're fighting the Congress over it. And Congress, of course, has been gridlocked on a range of issues. So what we're doing is what our founders intended, and that is for the states being laboratories of democracy to step up and make the change whenever, sometimes at the federal level, it doesn't happen. And you see all these members of the Senate from various states, House members from various states, that are standing up to defend that premium of citizenship, that right of citizenship. And we're confident this is going to pass in every state. I don't know, Paul, that we can do this, but I want to get a little friendly wager going on which one's going to win by the highest margin. I told Governor DeSantis of Florida the other day, I think Florida's at 79% when it passed, so I told the governor my goal was to beat him. And we'll have a little wager between our states here to see which state gets over 80. But this is a bipartisan issue. It should be. Anybody that tells you this is somehow against immigration or somehow it's against anybody based on race or creed, that's not true. This is about defending the rights and privileges of the citizenship of the United States of America. And ultimately, if you think about it, on the coin, we have two mottos in this country: in God we trust since the Cold War, but e pluribus unum, out of many one. And what we're trying to do through these ballot referenda in various states is defend that idea of out of many one. And what you have on the extreme left of this issue is people really who want you to be able to vote whether you know anything about the country or not. You heard our senator from Oklahoma a moment ago talk about this idea of coming in, knowing America is about economic opportunity, but knowing little else, and then going and voting without understanding what makes America tick. We need informed citizenship. We need people to know what they're voting on and understand the country, understand its values. And in other words, e pluribus unum, out of many one, not e pluribus pluribus. And that's what some folks want, is out of many, many. We're just going to have a free-for-all, and that does undermine the country's integrity. It does undermine the country's values. And we need that cohesivity to where citizenship has rights and responsibilities. It's two sides of the same coin. And so we're confident in South Carolina it's going to pass by an overwhelming majority. We had a 40-3 vote in the Senate, 118-0 in the House. We expect, I'm going to try to top 80% when we get to the ballot in November, and make sure we defend that right and responsibility that all American citizens have, and defend what it means to be a citizen of the United States of America. Thank you.
With that, let the senators come back up. Secretary Raffensperger, I believe, has had to leave, was subpoenaed for some court thing and so on. So we apologize for that. I'm sure he wasn't happy to be subpoenaed. But anyway, with that, thank you, senators, and let me open it up to any questions.
Thank you. I'm Julia Ainsley with NBC News. Thanks so much for doing this today. We're also hearing a lot right now about non-citizens voting in places where it's against the law. Do any of you have cases in your states that have been prosecuted because immigrants intentionally broke the law to vote?
Well, there are investigations in South Carolina. Yeah. So right now, we have not, to my knowledge, no one's been charged formally yet. There have been investigations in South Carolina in several jurisdictions. We've had people who were not eligible to vote. There are some discussions about that and looking at how some of these people are able to register who may not be eligible. And this typically happens, we haven't found in South Carolina this happened at a statewide election. Really the push, even for the non-citizen voting, is on school board elections and municipal elections. And that's where we seem to have the fall through the cracks. And if you look at our state constitution, it's a very simple change. I mean, it says every citizen of the state of South Carolina, of the United States of America, have the right to vote. But it sounds innocuous enough. You think, gosh, that means and most people, when you ask that question, say, well, that means only citizens can vote. Unfortunately, what's happened in jurisdictions like California, Vermont, New York, here in Washington even, is they've taken that as a floor, not a ceiling. And so you have this interpretation, well, they can extend the right of suffrage beyond just citizens. And so we're trying to close that loophole where we can really be sure that when any local municipality or school board tries to register somebody who's not a citizen, that's very clearly unconstitutional.
Anybody else?
There are,
Cases in your state that may have been prosecuted?
I will just point out, and I'm no expert on this, but there's a number of states, Georgia, Secretary Raffensperger mentioned he's done a check of the voter rolls. I know in Ohio, the Secretary of State, Frank LaRose, who led the charge there, they passed a citizen-only voting amendment in 2022. He has also done the same thing to look at the voter rolls and try to determine, are there people on those voting rolls who should not be there? I think it's a question of how big a problem is it. Obviously, anybody who votes illegally, that's a problem. But here, we're really dealing much more with, and exclusively with, non-citizens voting legally. And I think that's a decision that the public really has to weigh in on and say, do we want that to be happening? And of course, if the voters decide, as they have every time, that we want only citizens, then there is an enforcement part of that. There, you do have to follow up and make sure people follow the rules. But we're really at the point of setting those rules clearly. Yes.
I'm Arthur Delaney with HuffPost. Thank you. Do you think that there is a serious threat of non-citizens voting illegally at the federal level to such an extent that it could sway the presidential election in November?
You know, I don't have an educated opinion on that, really. I do know that there are cases like in Arizona where they require people to prove they're citizens in order to register to vote. If they can't prove they're citizens, they still get to register to vote using the federal form. So people in Arizona who haven't been able to show documentation to say they're citizens are only on the federal only list. How many of them are citizens or not citizens? Someone has to check into that and do the enforcement part of it and make sure. But there are problems out there. The key, it seems to me, and I'll let the senators go further if they want to, but the key to me is let's set the rules. And not, when I say let's set the rules, I mean let voters set the rules. And then I'm confident that over time we can enforce those rules. This isn't about, oh, this election or the last election. This is about policy across the board. And this is about not illegal non-citizen voting, but legal non-citizen voting.
I mean, so to that same point, I mean, not to put too fine a point on it, but to Paul's point, I mean, one of the things we've seen in South Carolina, and we've been able to address it at the state level, is whenever people go and register for like Medicare, Medicaid services, are given that federal form. And so even though you're maybe not a citizen, they fill out this provisional form to register. We will not allow that person to be registered if they can't prove it. So to the point about Arizona, in South Carolina, even if you get a form mailed to you for Medicare, Medicaid when you go enroll, we don't take that registration and put you on the voter rolls until we can verify citizenship. So I think to your point, is it enough to sway the election? I think it's a state-by-state issue. I mean, personally, I don't have enough evidence to tell you one way or the other. We're just trying to be sure that in every state where we're taking these actions, we're being very clear we're not going to allow that opportunity to exist. And that's where there's some tension between the federal and state. And the states are going to have to step up and be sure that when people get these forms, when they register for programs, for example, that that's not somehow making it onto the voter rolls, and that's going to be a challenge for every state in the country.
But people have to attest on that form that they're citizens and that they commit a crime if they say they are and they're not.
Sure.
That's true.
It would be a crime.
Let me go back here.
Hi, Molly Martinez, Great Television. Thanks so much for doing this. Some of the critics of this have said that this is a solution looking for a problem. I'm just wondering, looking back at past elections, you say this happens a lot on down ballot races. What kind of data are you seeing of instances in which this is actually occurring?
Go ahead.
So there are at least 2 court cases that have been working through the system where the word every has been used, as the senator said, as a floor, not a ceiling. And it's critical, at least for those court cases, to in North Carolina and in these other states, to give the people a chance to amend their constitution to use the word only, because that's the word these court cases have hinged upon. So that argument really, I have not heard that, and it's clearly debunked by those court cases.
And there's a broader issue when it comes to the problems that the American people are being saddled with in real time now. As a Navy intelligence officer, I look in questions of national security. With those undocumented and illegal immigrants into the United States, I would argue that they're a problem looking for the solution, and the solution is the undermining of our fabric of society, our governmental system, and there are individuals who are interested in exploiting their presence to try to manipulate and turn elections. So what we're trying to do is do an ounce of prevention so that we don't have a pound of cure to worry about later. So you have a lot of situations in Oklahoma where we've twice had bills that would bring and provide driver's license for illegal aliens. Unfortunately, that's also the source document, the #1 required document to be able to register to vote. And because of the reciprocity agreements among other states, you could literally get an undocumented license, go to another state, come back to Oklahoma, you effectively wash that, identifying as an undocumented driver's license. Now you can be right into the system, into the voting system. And we know people are going to manipulate that. The other thing in Oklahoma that we're seeing within the homeless populations that are being bussed in from out of state, they're trying to lower the barrier to get a driver's license or a state ID. We have the real ID, so you have to show your passport and your certificate, and if you've remarried and you're divorced and all of that stuff to prove you have the right to drive. And if you lower that requirement for the homeless community, all an undocumented worker has to do is come into that community, identify as a homeless person, get their ID, register to vote, and they're off and running again. And so what we're trying to make sure is if you are a legal citizen born here with the rights to vote, your vote can't be canceled or annulled because someone who came across the border is being used by organizations who are trying to disrupt the election process. So we're trying to prevent things from happening simply by affirming a very strong principle. You're a U.S. citizen, you can become a president of the United States. And if you're not a U.S. citizen, you shouldn't be voting, period.
Thank you. I won't speak for my colleagues in other states, but I can tell you people are tired of the government not being proactive when they can be and when they should be. And in this situation, we've got a concern that we're trying to be proactive for and address before it becomes a problem. That's what Only Citizens Voting is all about. And I think it's critically important for my colleagues and for the states that are putting this initiative forward to get a little bit of credit, because too often we hear, especially right here in Washington, D.C., about the gridlock and things don't happen and nothing moves. We're taking the bull by the horns in the state. In the state of Wisconsin, I don't know if we're going to be able to get to 80%, but we're going to pass this. We're going to take care of this concern before it becomes a problem.
That's a great point.
I have the mic. Federica Scouten with CNN. How are you? You mentioned Wisconsin. I mean, obviously, Wisconsin and North Carolina are potential battleground states in this election. And a number of folks have spoken about how popular this is. Can we talk a little bit about what this might mean in terms of driving Republican turnout and whether that might have an impact on the results this fall? The part one, and then part two, I'm curious about what sort of budget and effort you're putting into this in these 8 states this year.
Go ahead.
So from the North Carolina perspective, it is overwhelmingly popular in the state. So it crosses both lines. I mean, we have seen polling well into the 80s, close to 90% across our state. And in a state like mine, that encompasses unaffiliated voters, Republicans, and Democrats. So I think it's going to be an overwhelmingly popular choice amongst folks that are maybe voting in different ways on the overall ballot.
In terms of turnout for Republicans, I think a lot of people have tried to make it about that, saying we're doing this for Republican turnout. I will tell you, when I sponsored the referendum in South Carolina, one of the original co-sponsors after I introduced it was the Senate Minority Leader, who's a Democrat, because they recognize they can read the polls too. This is not a turnout issue just for Republicans. I think this is going to drive turnout, but frankly, just voters in general who are concerned about the issue. We're working pretty hard in South Carolina. I know the other senators are in their states to make sure everybody knows it's on the ballot and what it means. We feel it's going to drive up overall voter participation, not necessarily by party. The few folks that we had 3 Democrats in the Senate that voted against it, every one of them took a lot of heat for doing that, and their own party came out and endorsed the position. So I think it's going to drive turnout, but I don't think it's necessarily partisan. I think it's going to, a lot of people are going to want to vote and weigh in. We've seen the same numbers, 80% plus, depending, and that's across every demographic. Male, female, every racial demographic, Republican and Democrat. It's almost maybe a point or two difference between the parties in terms of registration. But we think it's a turnout tool for everybody. It's going to get people to show up to the polls, and they're concerned about election integrity. Both sides are. I mean, frankly, in the post-COVID world, a lot of things have changed. A lot of people are confused about changes in every state. This affirms that commitment by every state represented here to defend the integrity of the ballot box, and I think that's a bipartisan issue.
I just wanted to mention, so often I read articles and I see people talk about this as a turnout issue. And there's a negative connotation to that. And it strikes me that we want people to come out and vote. And the best way to get people to come out and vote is to give them something they really want to vote for. And so that part of this as a turnout issue, I want to just embrace because this is something voters care about. And I think we ought to have more turnout issues and spike that turnout.
But as a follow-up, the budget for this?
We will spend in each of these states. I don't know exactly what that spending will be, but it will be over 7 figures, not in each state, but overall. This has been a very grassroots campaign. We haven't had the millions that some folks do, but we will make certain that people hear about this and know that it's on the ballot, because I think they're going to be excited to know it.
The amendment went through the Iowa legislature twice. By percentage, what percentage of Democrats voted for it both times?
100%. Iowa is our, you may have known that. Iowa is our shining example in that both Iowa and Wisconsin had to vote twice in 2 separate legislative sessions, both houses, to make this, to put these on the ballot. In Iowa, they did it both times, every Republican, every Democrat. And I think you're going to see that this is the sort of thing that it's been blocked at different times. Usually it's been blocked by Democrats, but most Democrats support this issue. I don't know about most Democratic legislators, but the polls show overwhelmingly that Democrats support this issue, independents support this issue, Republicans support this issue.
Victoria Churchill, New York Post. In your opinion, how does non-citizen voter registration happen? I'm just talking, in Virginia specifically, just last month, the governor and the AG announced that there was 6,000 non-citizens cleared off the voting rolls. But how can we prevent them from registering in the first place?
Well, that's a great question, and folks may have some things I'll address it, but you might.
Well, sure. I mean, that's not what we talked about in South Carolina. One of the biggest issues, the way that happens in almost every state, are the federal registry. The way when you go register for services, Medicare, Medicaid's a great example of that, I believe. In our state, that was a big. People went kind of fired up over that when they heard that they're getting forms when people go register for Medicare, Medicaid, they're getting a registration form. That's true. I mean, that's just the federal policy. They do that. The states are going to have to police that and be sure whenever you get that form back, you're verifying whether those people are citizens or not. I think it's true in North Carolina. I'm sure it's true in Wisconsin, Oklahoma. We will take those. We obviously have to take those forms whenever those registration forms come in. But we do additional deep dive after that and make sure that they can prove documentation of being a citizen. It just comes down to diligence by the state. I mean, it's illegal, as we heard earlier. It's illegal to sign that attestation form and say you're a citizen and register to vote using a form you got when you registered for government services. But that didn't stop people. I mean, people do illegal things all the time. So what the state has to do is look at each one of those applications and ferret out whether it's real or not. Because it is true that you have Virginia 6,000, as you mentioned there. If you're in a tight election, that can really make some significant difference. But I think the bigger point we've all tried to make here today is not just that you have people who break the law and register illegally. We have to police that. But we also have to be sure that jurisdictions aren't doing it legally. And so what drives that is when you have a sanctuary city or a city that decides they're going to go register these folks who are not legally in the country legally. And we're trying to close that loophole because that makes it a lot harder for election officials to make a determination. So when you get one of those forms that's falsely attested to and people are illegally registering, if you have jurisdictions in a state or a state itself saying, well, gosh, you can do this, that makes it awfully hard for a voter registration board or a board of voter registration to actually determine whether that's an illegal voter or not. So we're trying, this is again, it's belts and suspenders approach to make it a lot easier to ferret out whether it's an illegal application.
One of the things we're looking at in Oklahoma is making sure there's no perverse incentive to artificially balloon the rolls. So one of the things we have in Oklahoma that needs to be addressed is there are bonuses the more people you have registered. And so what we realize is that initially I think that the thought was we're going to encourage them to really go out and robustly get all the citizens participating in the election. But it's punitive. They don't get the bonus if they start vetting and removing people who shouldn't be there. So we need to remove those perverse incentives that is actually encouraging a behavior that they can be financially rewarded with so that they can take a deep dive, make sure that everyone who is registered to vote should be voting and not penalize them financially because they're removing people who shouldn't, quite frankly, be on the rolls.
And I think another aspect of this is, it is when you encourage, I mean, some states are talking about, I believe there's, maybe Oregon has already done this, to say everyone's automatically registered to vote. And we have a system, as has been pointed out, where people get their driver's license or Medicare or whatever, and they're registered to vote. And I think oftentimes these non-citizens who are on the rolls didn't get on the rolls because they said, I want to go vote. I know it's illegal, but I want to do it anyway. They're being put on the rolls almost against their will, certainly without their knowledge that it's something bad. And then, of course, they're getting contact from the election boards saying, here's where your precinct is, and here's where the election is. And they're getting mail saying, go vote. So I think the system has encouraged a lot of putting non-citizens on the rolls, not in a, not where you have somebody going, I'm putting a non-citizen on the roll, but systematically, and it's a real problem. Yes.
Can I do a second?
Yes, and
Go for
then
it.
we'll
Go
go,
for
I'm
it.
sorry.
All good. No, go for it.
I got Julia Ainsley again with NBC. I had the opportunity to speak to a DC city councilman about why they passed the initiative they have here that allows non-citizens to vote. His reasoning, just the messenger here, was that these are people who are paying local taxes in many cases, that a lot of them have lived here for a long time, and that they're just voting for small things, school boards, so people who are going to fix their potholes, and that why should the rest of the country or other states care what's happening in DC when they're just trying to give local people a chance to weigh in on local issues. What do you all have to say about that?
We'll all comment on that one, sure.
I'll start. I would disagree that any of those things are small things. Local government, school boards are absolutely critical to the fabric of the republic, and we don't need to see those diminished and the voting rights of our citizenry diminished at that level or any other level. So I would push back on that. Anything about local elections, local government, school boards are small. I think they're vitally important.
You also find that it is at the local level where it's most directly applied and impacts families. So in the school board, that impacts your children. If you want to see families get riled up, start messing with their children. And that's an issue all across the United States. So school board elections are vital. And what we saw in the rollout of COVID, a lot of the draconian things that were put into place that were quite frankly a violation of the First Amendment, telling people they couldn't go to church, telling people they couldn't talk to each other, making them separate, all these types of social controls were implemented at the local level, where you started feeling government really going after and abridging your constitutional rights happened at that local level. So what we have to do for sure is make sure that anyone who is voting understands the First Amendment is part of the training. Quite frankly, my wife went through the citizenship training. The news media got wind that she was becoming a U.S. citizen, got the citizenship test, took it to my House colleagues, and many of them didn't pass. And at the end of the day, if you are here, you need to go through that training, understand the Constitution protects you from the majority who might want to take away your rights simply because they have more votes than you. So understanding fundamentally your constitutional rights protects you has to be applied at every single level of government, school boards, local elections, at every level.
Well, and I would say to that point, I mean, that DC City Councilman person basically said the quiet part out loud. Anybody that questions why we're here, I mean, I think he said the quiet part out loud, right? I mean, this notion that a school board or a local council doesn't matter, I mean, we've already heard it from the senator here. In our state, every school board has millage authority. They can raise your taxes. And so why would anybody support the notion that somebody who's not a citizen of the country can go vote to raise taxes on people who are citizens of the country? I mean, that's back to that family argument we heard earlier. You might invite your neighbor over for dinner, that's being neighborly, but you're not going to let your neighbor decide what your family budget is or how much money you're going to spend on the dinner. And to me, this idea that this doesn't matter, that's pretty crazy. I mean, and I think that underscores the whole point of every state up here having this amendment on the ballot. If you go to France right now and you buy a flat in Paris, you don't get to vote. I have a friend that has a place in the Bahamas. He didn't get to vote. He pays taxes, but he didn't vote. My wife still has property back in Ukraine. I'm not sure that property value is holding real great right now, but still got to pay taxes. We don't get to vote. I mean, no country in the world allows you to, as a non-citizen, go vote on tax increases or vote on local budgets if you're not a citizen of that country. So it's really crazy to me that anybody tries to guilt Americans into saying if you don't do this, somehow you're nativist or insensitive. Every country in the world that respects its sovereignty takes the same position we're all taking. I understand that if you're paying taxes, you say you want to have a vote. That's why you go through the process and become a citizen. We have that process available, but you've got to go through the process. We shouldn't allow anybody to raise taxes or make any kind of zoning decisions or school board decisions without being a citizen of this country. I think that, again, the quiet part was said out loud there. So I appreciate him saying it. It makes it, we might get over 80% in every state now.
And I'll just add real quick to that, that's the glory of the fact that it's a referendum. The people themselves are going to get to decide. And I think if they put it up to DC, maybe it would be a little bit of a different outcome. But in our states, we're going to give our people the opportunity, our citizens, to say whether or not non-citizens should have the right to vote in local elections. And I believe it's going to be overwhelming. I don't know if Wisconsin's going to hit 80%, but we're going to do our best to make sure we do. And it's been said before, and it'll be said again. The right to be a citizen, the right to vote, is so critical and it's so important to the fabric of who we are as Americans. It should be protected.
I would just add that it was the D.C. City Council that passed this. We don't know where the voters are in D.C. I'd like to find out. We may poll. You may see an initiative at some point. New York City, we did poll the weekend before that city council overwhelmingly passed non-citizen voting there that would allow 800,000 to 1 million non-citizens to vote. 62% of New Yorkers were opposed to it, and less than 30% were in favor of it. So it's the sort of thing where I think by and large the public clearly doesn't agree. But the concept of it is no taxation without representation. And this is really stretching that beyond all, relevance, because, we travel somewhere and we, buy a Coke, we pay taxes. We don't get to vote in that city. And it's the sort of thing where, of course, here, in some cases, I remember reading an article in Maine where a woman in Portland, Maine, they were talking about doing this. They defeated it years ago. They're still talking about putting it back on the ballot. But a woman said, I've been here for almost 20 years, and I don't get to vote. But I just don't want to give up my British citizenship. And I think we can all understand that. But that's the choice. Vote in Britain or vote here. And we call them non-citizens, but each and every one of them is a citizen of some country. So they've got to make the choice to come here. And there's one other aspect of it that sort of bugs me, which is this idea that it's just local. And I think the senators kind of knocked that out of the park, but I want to add one thing to it. In our system, the state trumps the local, and the federal trumps the state. And so if I believed that people had a right to vote, then I don't know how I could say they have that right, but only locally, so that it could be trumped by the state or by the federal government. If you have a right to vote, you have a right to vote at all levels of government. And I think it kind of shows that this argument is not really very solid.
Jessica Sonkin, Fox News. Pivoting back over to the Hill, wanted to ask you all about Speaker Johnson potentially adding the SAVE Act to this upcoming interim spending bill. Do you have any concerns about a potential shutdown if he is to include this bill, given the Senate majority and administration stances?
Sure. I'll answer all these questions. Look, I think anybody, that's going to be an interesting test. I support the speaker putting it into the, I support that. I think it's a question that needs to be asked. I said that earlier. One of the reasons every state here represented is taking this action is because, frankly, the federal government hasn't. A lot of things you've seen states do is because the federal government doesn't take action. Of course, there's this argument that if Speaker Johnson puts it in, he's leading to a government shutdown, but I can flip the script for 1 second. I'll be partisan on this one for a minute because I'm a Republican member. If Democrats really want to shut down the federal government over letting non-citizens vote, I think that's a losing issue. Let them do it. You can't blame Speaker Johnson for shutting down the government if Democrats in the Senate refuse to defend the integrity of elections. I mean, I think we've heard here everybody talking about, in both parties, it's overwhelming support for these referendums, overwhelming support for the SAVE Act, if you really hear what's in it. When you talk about defending citizen-only voting, both parties, it's double-digit leads. So if Democrats really want to shut down the federal government over that, I think they own it. I don't think you can blame Speaker Johnson for that. I think he has every right to include that in the spending bill. I think it's common sense. And if we're going to play chicken over that issue, I don't think Johnson's the one that's going to be responsible for a shutdown.
And I would say, I would love for elected officials to go on the record and say, we want non-citizens voting in our elections so that their constituents back home see what they're really doing. And like in Oklahoma, we have a balanced budget amendment, and a lot of the people who did not support this amendment, they weren't invited to come back to the Capitol by their own constituents who wanted them to come home and think about their life choices. So yeah, go on the record. Let's see where you stand.
Thank you. Unless there's another question, I'm going to close it. Thank you very much for coming. These senators will be here if you have more questions, and so will a number of other folks that you were introduced to this morning, all of whom have made this happen. 8 states, 42 million people live in those states, will be voting in November.
Thank you, sir.